We are Nigan Placa, the indigenous people of this continent. We are still in fear. We are still in fear. We are still in fear.
Yeah, for 5 centuries I lived amongst my enemies. Brought smallpox from overseas, a lockbox, I hold the key. Knowledge is liberation, topple in a white nation. Persecute the police for the racially motivated crimes and assassinations. Set forth a revelation, civil arrest, continue conquest. Abomination aimed at my relations. Covert operations, Fed funded warfare in Chiapas meant to slay us. Not to mention Reagan or the Mayan racial cleansing, like African descendants facing lynching by the henchmen in white sheets of death heads. Where racism's prejudice is only exceeded, sadly, by its ignorance and arrogance of terrorists who mean a turban tenements constructed by the government to widen the divide of the rich and the rest of us. Like my one's resentment is my sentiment. If I were regiment, free me of oppression.
We are the 5% of our people who remain from the Holocaust, right? We are the 5% of our people who remain from the Holocaust, right? We are the 5% of our people who remain from the Holocaust.
Profile my kind, the racial lines of the divide, but it's no longer black and white. It's corporatized, conservative and white. Tea sipping slime, treading on the serpent with an eagle on my mind. I hold my line.
They killed 70 to 100 million of our people. 95% of our people were killed. We are the 5% that survived. They destroyed our cities, burned our schools and libraries, executed our leaders and teachers. They did all of this to us in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, everywhere on our continent. They did this to us, a people who have a place like Aral in Peru, with pyramids older than Egypt. Would have been beautiful if the Europeans came here, and even if they had to maybe equivalent to what they did, the British did in India, where they somewhat left the culture intact. And imagine what would have survived in terms of the books that would not have been burned, the rituals and ceremonies that you talk about in Bali. That's part of what was destroyed, in addition to the population, where we lost 90 to 95% of the population to mostly smallpox and that's kind of what's hard sometimes, to visualize what the world would have been like.
If that had not happened, in other words, the introduction of all these European diseases, the populations would have been enormous, indigenous populations in the New World. Europeans would have been forced to do what the British did in India, and that is adopt the principle of indirect rule, to leave everything in place and persuade the local authority structure to act in their behalf, which is what happened in India. And eventually, independence would have happened, as it did in India. There would have been representation in the United Nations, Aztec representation, Mexica representation, Maya representation, Quechua representation, which doesn't exist now.
It doesn't. There's dancing around the issue of smallpox. It was first used in the Canary Islands, used in the Caribbean, used in Mexico, used in Inca, and beyond that into South Africa, into the Polynesian areas, into Australia. Everywhere where it could possibly use was used 100% of the time, yet it was an accident. So what would they say in a court of law?
You know, the Canaries are interesting, what they did in the Canaries. It was a dress rehearsal.
For imperialism and colonialism,
yeah,
and the Holocaust that were committed around the world, down to the Jewish Holocaust.
Yes.
You can trace it all back to the popes and the papal bulls saying, "Have at it."
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, there was a dividing line. Of course, it went right down the globe. On one side, Spaniards do your stuff. The other side, Portuguese do your stuff.
But I'm talking about the earlier papal bulls from the 1450s that basically says you can go into non-Christian areas, you can take what they have, you can kill them, you can enslave them. That's more what that one. That is basically gave moral authority to kill, to steal, to enslave, to destroy. So with that and the fact that they were using the smallpox, that's what made the Europeans worldwide the powerful, wealthy people that they are today. And it's inconvenient to talk about all of this. And that's why even with David Standard with the American Holocaust book, or even Ward Churchill, he'll focus mostly on Native American U.S. and talking about the smallpox, but he's talking about the itsy-bitsy uses of smallpox.
Yes.
Yeah, and then David...
infected blankets.
Yeah, which is totally meaningless in context of the full use of it throughout the whole continent. So even these people that are very progressive and all that, they don't want to say this was intentionally done. Yeah. But I've used the example of, okay, you got a traveling salesman, he travels throughout the U.S., in 44 of the cities that he's been to, and in those hotels there's been a murder that's taken place, and he's only been to 44 places. Now, what are the odds that he was not involved in at least one of those murders? Yeah. And most likely was involved in all of those murders. Yeah. In a court of law, would be prosecuted. Yeah. Right? Just circumstantial evidence. Yeah. And the circumstantial evidence says they may not have understood the mechanics or the biology of smallpox, but they knew how to spread it. Yes. And of course, it was great profit, and you get free land, free gold, and you can look in terms of the Caribbean, but more specifically with the Mexica, where the ruler ends up dying, Cuitlahuac ends up dying from smallpox, or you go into the south with the Inca, before they even arrived.
It
had already. So that's pretty effective use of
before they got to Guatemala.
Yeah.
And going ahead.
Yeah. So, and of course, even in the southeast, the use of with DeSoto. Yeah. So you have this constant use of it. At what point do you stop saying it was an accident?
I see what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. And this is one of the points that we're trying to get across. This was not an accident. They didn't understand the biology of it,
Yeah,
but they knew. You don't have to know the biology of it, and this is one of the things that changed our whole world.
Thank you, Shai. Tonight's speaker in Vanderbilt University's Holocaust Lecture Series is David E. Stannard, Chair of the American Studies Department at the University of Hawaii. In 1992, Professor Stannard published a book entitled American Holocaust, Columbus and the Conquest of the New World. While speakers and writers across this nation were celebrating the so-called discovery of America, with token recognition of Native American suffering and loss, Stannard had the audacity to show how Columbus's voyages actually launched the violent destruction of indigenous peoples for centuries to come. David Stannard received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 1975. In American Holocaust, Professor Stannard masterfully synthesized huge amounts of historical and archaeological material that had already been revising what we know and how we think about conquest of the Americas. David Stannard has taught at Yale University, Stanford University, and the University of Colorado, and has been on the faculty of the University of Hawaii since 1979. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Stannard.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank all of you for being here. Oxford had published 2 of my previous books, and my editor, Sheldon Meyer, told me he was eager to publish this one as well. The only problem, he said, might be my tentative title, American Holocaust. The controversial nature of the book's title, specifically my use of the word Holocaust to describe the destruction of tens of millions of lives in North and South America that occurred as a consequence of European and American conquest and settlement between the 15th and the 19th centuries. I told Sheldon that I wasn't insistent on the title. It was one of several that I had in mind, although it did seem to me to be appropriate. As he knew, I was just then finishing a monograph that you've just heard about, that I called Before the Horror, a monograph for another publisher on the massive population collapse suffered by native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders in the wake of European and American contact and colonization. Those demographic disasters had been the result almost entirely of introduced disease. In researching that book, I had, of necessity, done some comparative work on the conquest of the Americas, focusing especially on the devastating impact of introduced diseases such as smallpox among American Indian populations with no previous exposure to them. What I inadvertently had found, however, was much more disturbing, and that was the horrifying level of deliberate and widespread mistreatment, enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and outright mass slaughter of native peoples that was recorded on page after page, in volume after volume, of the settlers' own historical recollections and records. To me, it appeared to be nothing less than a Holocaust, and that was what I now wanted to write about in this new book. One thing was settled. The title would be American Holocaust. There was no question, he said, that what I had described did indeed constitute a Holocaust. Holocaust is a very old word, dating back to at least the 13th century, and originally meaning a sacrifice consumed by fire or a burnt offering. Later, around the 15th century, it began taking on a more general and secular meaning, specifically a great slaughter or sacrifice. Thus, in the early 16th century, the famous Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas used the word Holocaust to describe the Spaniards' ongoing destruction of immense numbers of native people in the Caribbean and Latin America. In the late 1940s, following almost 3 centuries of colonial and then federal assaults on Indians, from mass murder, land confiscation, ethnic cleansing by way of forced removal, and then confinement of the small remnant of survivors to what were often barren enclaves known as reservations, the American government decided to establish an Indian policy it officially called liquidation. The idea behind the new policy was to extinguish once and for all everything that was Indian about Indians by abolishing their tribes and their treaty relationships while seizing what was left of their land. It was to be an extermination campaign, not one aimed at individual lives, but at the entirety of these indigenous peoples' greatly varied and distinctive ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, and religions, all of which are tied to tribal identities and ancestral land bases. The Indians, of course, resisted this extermination campaign, just as they had resisted invasion and conquest and annihilation for centuries. But in just a dozen years, between 1954 and 1966, when the policy itself finally was terminated, more than 100 tribes and bands had been dissolved and more than 1.3 million acres of Indian land had been taken. This was on top of the countless other tribes, millions of lives, and 2 billion acres of land that had been destroyed, lost, or seized from Indians before the end of the 19th century. which finally brings me back to the genocidal destruction of North and South America's native people, and the strong resistance by some commentators to my use of the word genocide in describing that destruction. Commentators like the recently convicted felon, Senator Ted Stevens, who threatened to use his considerable power to cut off funding of the Smithsonian Institution if it used the word genocide, as it had planned to do in a documentary film on the destruction of the America's native people. Commentators, in short, who would prefer that those millions of bodies remain buried and forgotten in Charney's conceptual black hole. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas during the course of 4 long centuries, from Columbus's first landing at Hispaniola in 1492 to the massacre at Wounded Knee in December of 1890, or over the course of 5 centuries, if we bring accounts forward to the US-supported genocide in Guatemala during the 1980s and beyond, I must confess that it is impossible for me here tonight to describe specific events in any detail. That's what I did over the course of several hundred pages in American Holocausts, and even then I barely scratched the surface of what, in North America alone, began with the deliberate, calculated extermination of the Indians of Virginia in the 17th century, what Yale genocide scholar Ben Kiernan recently described as genocide on the Carthaginian model, so total was the destruction, to the state and federally financed mass killing of 60% of California's Indians in just 8 years in the middle of the 19th century. For what happened on other blood-soaked soil during the 2 centuries in between these genocides. Sorry, I lost my place. I'm afraid you'll have to read American Holocaust or some of the more recent works that I will mention later. Let me just say for the moment, however, that the claim of Euro-American genocide as one of the primary agents responsible for the deaths of millions of indigenous people throughout the Western Hemisphere was hardly original with me. In fact, the first person to make that case was the very man who coined the word genocide and who relentlessly and heroically pressed the United Nations to declare it an international crime, a law professor and a Polish Jew who had lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust, Raphael Lemkin. It's commonly thought that in his efforts to name and define genocide as a crime, Lemkin was focused exclusively on the then ongoing extermination of Jews in Nazi Germany, and this is incorrect. Recent research in the Lemkin archives at New York's American Jewish Historical Society, the New York Public Library, and the Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati has revealed the existence of detailed manuscript writings from the 1940s in which Lemkin, obviously preparing at least one book on genocide, probably more, left numerous folders filed under what he regarded as a variety of genocidal events in history, including, and the titles are his, quote, Spanish treatment of South American Indians, North American Indians, extermination, History of Genocide, projected book on North American Indian research, and much more. In a 1948 report to a foundation that was supporting his work, Lemkin listed what he called 10 specific genocide cases, this is the phrase he used, on which he was compiling information, and I quote, to be made available to the United Nations Drafting Committee on Genocide. One of those 10 cases is labeled the Indians in Latin America. Another is the Indians in North America. And then finally, in the 1950s, Lemkin's archives reveal still more folders bulging with information on these subjects, including the draft of a 100-page essay on genocide against Indians, one that includes sections on their incarceration in what he calls concentration camps. He was, of course, referring to reservations. By the late 1950s, Lemkin had almost completed a massive book on genocide in world history, the entire third section of which was to be given over to genocides in colonial settings, with separate chapter titles listed on genocide against the American Indians, Latin America, genocide against the Aztecs, the Yucatan, genocide against the Incas, and then on to European genocides against the natives of New Zealand, Australia, Southwest Africa, and more. But in 1959, Lemkin died of a heart attack in a hotel room in New York City. He was not yet 60 years old. the book was unfinished. But even if it had been completed, it probably never would have been published, because by then a new orthodoxy was beginning to take hold in the United States and elsewhere, one that viewed the Holocaust as a singular, unique, genocidal event in world history. To some proponents of this idea, the Holocaust was not only the preeminent genocide, it was the only genocide. Entitled Genocide, a comprehensive introduction by Adam Jones, a portion of which explores in detail the theoretical and substantive arguments leading to the inescapable conclusion that the native people of the Americas were indeed victims of genocide. There really is no longer much question as to what the proper term should be for the euphemism of American expansion, the phrase that most of us learned in our high school and college history classes. It was indeed Euro-American expansionism that made the United States what it is today, but expansionism so bloody that it worked hand in glove with genocide as it made its way across the continent. The American Holocaust is a matter of history, but the wreckage that it caused remains vividly evident among many of its survivors' descendants today. From the desert southwest of Arizona to the Black Hills of South Dakota and beyond, many American Indian communities barely survive, mired in poverty and despair that has little equal except in some of the world's most desperately impoverished so-called third world countries. Alcoholism, diabetes, and suicide rates are sky high, while infant mortality and life expectancy rates at places like Pine Ridge Reservation are as bad as in Haiti and some of the poorest countries of Africa. At the University of Hawaii, I teach a course on race and racism, and one of the central things I try to make clear is that racism kills. While it is essential that we as a nation face up to the genocidal realities of our past, that's only the beginning. The simmering bigotry and malign neglect of the present continue to kill those people among us whose ancestors first settled this land thousands and thousands of years ago. It's way past time for the nation as a whole and for all of us to begin repairing that terrible damage. Thank you.
Before the discovery of the smallpox vaccine, smallpox was in fact used as a weapon. Smallpox was in fact used as a weapon. A weapon. Terrorism is not only an attack using weapons of mass destruction or chemicals, but also includes weapons of viruses, bacteria, and other germs. This form of terrorism is called bioterrorism. If these germs were used to intentionally infect people, they would cause the most illness and death. Some of them can be spread through air, others can be spread through water or food supplies. Diseases such as plague and smallpox were long ago used as weapons by mankind.
Then it produced real catastrophes, events described as virgin soil epidemics. These were catastrophes that accompanied European expansion to the New World, Australia, New Zealand. And there, smallpox had a transformative importance in clearing the land and promoting settlement by Europeans with their robust immunity. The impact of smallpox was greater than that of gunpowder. The Spaniards militarily dispossessed the Amaraks of their land and intended to reduce them to slavery, first in mines and then on the land. They were assisted in the process, up to a point, by two great assets, gunpowder and disease. And as you know from reading Fenn, the Aboriginal population of the Americas lacked immunity to European diseases like smallpox. Disease thoroughly cleared Hispaniola for European colonization, virtually without resistance. A similar story could be told about Hernán Cortés and his fellow conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, with regard to the Aztec Empire of Mexico and the Incan Empire of Peru, which were destroyed not only by gunpowder, but also by smallpox, that destroyed agriculture, led to famine, destroyed the Aboriginal military capacity to resist.
And one way to start thinking about the way that this world that I showed you was shattered by the arrival of Europeans, you can see here, this is a Dutch genre painting. It shows a bunch of lower middle class people living in their barn. And this was a way that countless numbers of people in Europe, Asia, and Africa had lived for thousands of years, surrounded by domestic animals. And the reason that this is important, you can see here, the cows and the horses and the sheep. And the reason that it's important is that, as we know from things like bird flu, every now and then an animal disease, as scientists say, jumps the species barrier, mutates, and becomes a human disease. And so if you're an epidemiologist, this picture looks something like this. And so you have cows, which are the, bovine rinderpest is the origin of measles, bovine tuberculosis is the origin of TB, poultry is the origin of influenza and whooping cough, and then there's the horse. There's a lively argument whether it's actually horses or camels or the origin of smallpox. There's a certain origin of equine encephalitis, which those of us on the East Coast are dealing with now. And then up in the rafters are the bats, which are the origin of rabies. And so Europeans, Asians, and Africans were swimming in this kind of soup of bacteria and virus for thousands and thousands of years. Now let's look at a picture of a North American home from the same time. This is a reconstruction of a Powhatan longhouse. If you're an architect, the first thing you notice is this is identical to that European home. It's all built out of lashed together timbers. They didn't have nails, and nobody could afford nails in Europe. They don't have any windows. They're windowless structures. They don't have any fireplaces. They just have this opening here. The big difference here is not in the building, but here. All the animals are dead. It's Sarah Palin's dream house, right? And the reason for this is that by a quirk of history, there were very, very few domestic animals or domesticable animals in the Americas at the time of Columbus. There are no cattle, there are no horses, there are no goats, no sheep, no pigs, no poultry, and there are no analogs to them. So native peoples here didn't live around their animals, and they didn't, therefore, swim in this kind of bacterial and viral soup. So there's this huge epidemiological imbalance between their part of the world and our part of the world. And so over here is a partial list of the diseases that went this way in the first 150 or so years after Columbus. And over here is a pretty complete list of the diseases that went the other way. And so so the Europeans Columbus and his successors brought this absolute cavalcade of diseases over, and the results were catastrophic. In the first 150 or so years after Columbus, somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of the original inhabitants of the Americas died. And if I had, my one thing that I could put in those 8th grade US history textbooks would be this, because it goes a long way towards explaining why small groups of poorly equipped Europeans at the end of very long supply chains could survive, establish themselves in landscapes that were completely unfamiliar to them. Without this first wave of the Columbian exchange, it's really hard to imagine how my ancestors could have got here and made it, and I dare say the same is true for many of your ancestors.
This is a good proper 1500 period gun. It's what's called a matchlock. And the ignition is actually by this burning cord.
The Aztecs designed their shields to stop darts and arrows, not Spanish bullets.
It went all the way through. There's a real psychological effect to these things. You have this tremendous noise and fire.
Oh, man. There's this big flash of light that goes up in your face.
Spanish steel armor could withstand most Aztec weapons. But it didn't cover the whole body.
Actually, this is pretty typical of kills, because most of the wounds the Spaniards took were down the neck and under the arm and around the armor.
While gunpowder gave the Spanish a clear technological advantage in long-range exchanges, it was not a practical weapon for close contact.
The problem is how slow it was to load and reload, and having to then protect your marksmen before they were taken out by other weaponry from the native peoples.
In close quarters, the two armies used very different swords.
This is called a maquawit. It's a wooden sword. It was inset with very sharp obsidian blades. These are just like very, very sharp knives. Very brittle, though, but extremely effective in cutting. It would be very effective, as you can imagine, as a slashing item. Right? If you were to slash, and that would cut right through your arm.
Now that was a cut. You see the cut in here easily, 6, 7 inches. Single blow cutting right through that. Like easily lethal blows. Easily.
Though not as powerful, the Spanish sword was faster and just as deadly. Steel swords also had an advantage against the Aztec Stone Age sword.
You can see the damage here. We've lost almost our entire row of blades. The wood has been damaged beyond repair, but the impact really annihilated this weapon. This has an exceedingly sharp edge, razor sharp, but not very durable.
Close up, the two armies would have fought to a draw. And at longer range, gunfire was not enough to ensure Spanish victory, because the Indians had a deadly countermeasure. The sling.
Clearly lethal if you're unarmored. Yeah. The face, break the cheekbone, put him out of commission. In a battle, there would have been thousands of these. So I think, all in all, excellent weapon.
The Aztecs used perfectly rounded clay balls and stones as projectiles for the sling. They traveled at more than 150 miles per hour. Their consistent size and weight made them deadly accurate.
Then it produced real catastrophes, events described as virgin soil epidemics. These were catastrophes that accompanied European expansion to the New World, And there, smallpox had a transformative importance in clearing the land and promoting settlement by Europeans with their robust immunity. The impact of smallpox was greater than that of gunpowder. The Aboriginal population of the Americas lacked immunity to European diseases like smallpox. Disease thoroughly cleared Hispaniola for European colonization, virtually without resistance. A similar story could be told about Hernan Cortés and his fellow conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, with regard to the Aztec Empire of Mexico and the Incan Empire of Peru, which were destroyed not only by gunpowder, but also by smallpox, that destroyed agriculture, led to famine, destroyed the Aboriginal military capacity to resist.
The New World was not conquered. It was infected.
Yeah.
And this is...
Infected.
Infected.
That's an excellent...
Moreover, Germany is home to at least 8 major Holocaust memorials or museums, among more than 60 similar institutions throughout the world, including a dozen or so in the United States. And this is as it should be. But where in Germany is the memorial to, say, the Herero people? The Herero are one of several national and ethnic groups in Southwest Africa who also felt Germany's genocidal wrath, but decades before the Holocaust, at the turn of the 20th century. By the time the killing ended, 2/3 of the natives of that region had been wiped out by the Germans, exterminated. Although the total number killed was far lower than the Holocaust, this was roughly the same rate of extermination as the one suffered by European Jews during the 1930s and 40s. Moreover, in the midst of the killing, in 1906, a German military commander published a book that justified the slaughter as necessary for attainment of what Benny Morris so cheerfully later called the overall final good. And like Morris, a century later, he used the United States treatment of American Indians as a touchstone. This process, he wrote, referring to the extermination of what he called the weak and purposeless Africans, and I'm quoting him here, is played out elsewhere and in a variety of ways, such as, for example, in the elimination of the American Indians because they were without purpose in the continued development of the world, unquote. They were without purpose. Note the casual past tense in referring to the millions of native people who once lived in North America alone, to say nothing of the vastly greater numbers who had lived in Mexico and Central and South America, but who by that time in North America had been reduced in number by more than 90% to several 100,000.
The idea of Europe bringing civilization to the Americas simply flips truth on its head. This is what European explorers actually found in North America.
Far and away the most beautiful city on Earth. 5 times the size of London or Rome. Great towers and buildings rising from the water. 60,000 gleaming houses, and how spacious and how well built they were. Of beautiful stonework and cedar wood, and the wood of other sweet-scented trees. The many streets and boulevards of the city were so neat and well swept, despite the multitude of inhabitants, crisscrossed with a complex network of canals, like an enormous Venice, but also remarkable floating gardens that reminded of nowhere else on Earth.
While Europe was drinking water from its polluted city rivers, huge aqueducts transported America's water from fresh springs.
But what impressed most were the special merchant areas, where timber and tiles and other building materials were bought and sold, as well as greengrocer streets, where one could buy every sort of vegetable, fruits, honeys, nut paste and chocolates. Astonished by the personal cleanliness and hygiene of the colorfully dressed populace, and by their extravagant use of soaps, deodorants, and breath sweeteners.
Most Europeans never bathed and kept clothes on at all times. The Pilgrim's Notes biographer Zini Feiner had a terrible smell. Indians tried, quote, without success to teach them to bathe. The settlers also had bad breath from rotting teeth. Death and starvation was so common that corpses were just dumped in open pits known as poreholes. Many turned to alcohol and committed suicide. In fact, the story of the first settlers has been deliberately changed, notes author James Lowen, because the truth is so shameful. They actually settled hundreds of miles further south and stayed in America because the mission was a failure. Their real aim, reports historian Robert Beverly, was to find some gold and take it back to Europe.
They spend their days digging random holes in the ground, haplessly looking for gold instead of planting crops. Soon they were starving and digging up putrid Indian corpses to eat. They took some Indian prisoners and forced them to teach the colonists how to farm.
And the meal with the natives.
An American president of that same era expressed much the same sentiment, and with equal satisfaction. He began with a comment about one particular unprovoked late 19th century raid by U.S. soldiers on an Indian community in Colorado, a raid planned specifically for a time when all the young Indian men would be away hunting, so there would only be unarmed women, children, and old men in the village. As the troops approached on horseback, the Indians waved to welcome them, and the elders held a large white flag aloft. A short time later, hundreds of Indians, almost everyone in the village, lay dead. In the aftermath, according to subsequent accounts of the soldiers themselves, they went systematically from body to body, scalping and mutilating the dead, castrating the corpses of old men and small boys. Let me just quote a snippet of one soldier's lengthy testimony before the United States Congress, and many of them testified. Quote, "The men used their knives," he said, "ripped open women, clubbed little children, beat their brains out. In numerous instances, men cut out the private parts of females and stretched them over their saddle bows and wore them over their hats while riding in the ranks. One man cut a squaw's heart out and stuck it up on a stick." When asked about this ghastly event, President Theodore Roosevelt, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, said it was as righteous and beneficial a deed as ever took place on the frontier. Later, referring to the overall long history of the destruction of the American Indians, Roosevelt dismissed any possible concerns by saying that the Indians were, quote, "an alien race that held a coveted prize in its feeble grasp," unquote. That prize was land, and the Americans wanted it. Therefore, the Indians' annihilation, the president concluded, was both, I'm quoting him again, beneficial and inevitable.
No, 400,000 Africans who came late in the game did not build America from picking cotton.
Colonization was motivated by the European hunger for African resources. The subsequent exploitation of the African people and the uprooting of their spiritual values by Christian missionaries would leave a permanent European stamp on the continent.
The mindset is the barbarians are backward and inferior, and for their own benefit we have to uplift them and civilize them and educate them and so on. The psychology behind it is kind of transparent. I mean, when you've got your boot on someone's neck and you're crushing them, you can't say to yourself, "I'm a son of a bitch, and I'm doing it for my own benefit." So what you have to do is figure out some way of saying, "I'm doing it for their benefit." And that's a very natural position to take when you're beating somebody with a club.
Britain cut the largest piece of African cake from Cairo to Cape Town, in addition to Nigeria and a few West African regions. It was also the British Empire that in 1894 imposed an arbitrary boundary around the many diverse ethnic groups and kingdoms that would make up Uganda. The southern Bantu-speaking people were given economic, political, and educational advantage. The northern ethnic groups, two in particular, the Acholi and the Langi, were the main recruits for military and police positions. By exploiting linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences between the peoples of the North and South, Britain's divide and rule policies created a tension between them that helped maintain British rule. The French took an east-west slice of the continent as well as Madagascar. The Belgians took Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congo in what Joseph Conrad called the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. Slave labor took over 5 million lives. In Rwanda, Belgium entrenched the idea of the Hutu as a workforce and the Tutsi as extenders of Belgian rule. The politicization of these two cultures would profoundly contribute to the genocide of 1994. In Sudan, the British ruled the Arabs in the north and the blacks in the south as separate colonies, only to combine the areas before independence in 1956. The result has been relentless civil war, the Darfur massacres being the latest tragedy. The Portuguese decimated Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau well into the 1970s. The Italians took Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. The Germans added Cameroon and Tanzania and committed the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero people.
White folks were so good to me till when I got sick and disabled to work, to just come in and bring me something to eat, clothes, and everything. Fed me, clothed me, and I had a house full of children, and they fed my children. Yes, sir, I've been working all of my life, and the white folks raised me. Mister, I tell you the truth, I don't know what in the world I'd do without white folks. Now, that's the truth. And misters, I'm just a white folks nigger. I'm a nigger and all of my children's a nigger. And all this community in here of Mississippi recognize, appreciate it, and work for the white folks.
The Negro is not a part of my family. As a result, I don't elect to have him sit and eat with me. As a result, I don't elect to have him belong to a club that I may belong to. I don't elect to...
For Judge Obar, as for most Southern whites, out of the past has come a philosophy he calls the Southern way of life. The Negro and his place is at the heart of it.
This is the way it has been. It's the history of the South. It's because we've been brought up like this. We have been taught like this. And we teach our children like this. And they'll teach their children like that. I think it is a matter that has been history all down through the years and will remain history.
To be white is to be a striver,
right,
a crusader, an explorer, and a conqueror. We build, we produce, we go upward. And we recognize the central lie of American race relations. We don't exploit other groups. We don't gain anything from their presence. They need us and not the other way around.
But who's the one group that conquered North America and owned it in every way possible? Europeans. Our ancestors toiled the fields, mines, harvested resources, invented technology, worked the factories, and built the infrastructure. They did it. Land doesn't build itself. There is no magical dirt. Europeans were toiling the fields long before the first African slave landed on their shores. There was no USA before Europeans, let alone the concept of legally protected land. There wasn't even a light bulb before us.
There is genocide going on, and what we're proposing with Mexica Movement is that let's focus on the history, getting people to know the history. We should know it, but the Criollos need to know it, the Europeans, but also the African descent people and the Asian descent people, they need to know the true history, that this was not empty land, that this was not savages, that there were cities, the majority living in urban settings and all of that.
Well, all you have to do is to look at domestic plants. for instance, I have an Italian cousin who thinks that the Spaniards won because they were superior, had a superior civilization. And I argued with him. I said, all right, let's look at a list of all the important economic plants and food plants that were domesticated in the New World, particularly Mesoamerica, versus what was domesticated in Europe. In Europe, there wouldn't be one plant mentioned. There's nothing. They've never domesticated anything. The Spaniards, what did they ever domesticate? Absolutely zero. They got it all from domestic plants from the Middle East. You take a list for Mesoamerica, it's this long, of just incredible numbers of things that were domesticated consciously by the Mesoamerican people through plant breeding, through careful selection and everything.
But the Europeans are under the illusion that they developed agriculture, they invented the wheel, that they had nothing to do with any agricultural development. Even what they think with the Greeks were just an offshoot of the Middle East. That had nothing to do with Europe.
Yeah.
But they like they say in Spanish, se ponen moños, oh, well, we did this. You guys didn't even have the wheel, which is not true. But the Europeans never developed the wheel. They didn't develop writing.
Yeah.
They didn't develop all the things that they want to claim. They didn't invent the printing press. They didn't.
That's correct.
There's a whole bunch of different things that they automatically assume.
They didn't invent paper either.
They didn't invent paper. They didn't or any writing system too.
That's correct.
So you have a lot of misinformation that's out there about our civilizations here, the conditions. It's kind of like when people start talking about, okay, there were civilizations, but human sacrifice. So they get right away into that, and so it was human sacrifice, so we don't need to talk about it anymore. How about the Inquisition? Well, there were more people actually being killed by the Inquisition than in Europe than the whole population of the Western Hemisphere in terms of what human sacrifice was going on, if you take into account the tortures and people who died,
burning people alive,
yeah.
That's the most painful way
but
to die.
But in the name of Jesus Christ, so they were sacrificing to their God.
Yes.
So, but they don't want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
The Spain that Christopher Columbus and his crews left behind just before dawn on August 3rd, 1492, as they sailed forth from Palos and out to the Atlantic, was for most of its people a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. In this respect, Spain was no different from the rest of Europe. Epidemic outbreaks of plague and smallpox, along with routine attacks of measles, influenza, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, and more frequently swept European cities and towns clean of 10 to 20% of their populations at a single stroke. As late as the mid-17th century, more than 80,000 Londoners, 1 out of every 6 residents in the city, died from plague in a matter of months. And again, as with its companion diseases, the pestilence they called the Black Death returned. Like most of the other urban centers in Europe, says one historian who has specialized in the subject, every 25 or 30 years, sometimes more frequently, the city was convulsed by a great epidemic. Indeed, for centuries, an individual's life chances in Europe's pest-house cities were so poor that the natural populations of the towns were in perpetual decline that was offset only by in-migration from the countryside. In-migration, says one historian, that was vital if the cities were to be preserved from extinction. Famine, too, was common. What J.H. Eliot has said of 16th century Spain has held true throughout the continent for generations beyond memory. The rich ate, and ate to excess, watched by 1,000 hungry eyes as they consumed their gargantuan meals. The rest of the population starved. This was in normal times. The slightest fluctuation in food prices could cause the sudden deaths of additional tens of thousands who lived on the margins of perpetual hunger. So precarious was the existence of these multitudes in France that as late as the 17th century each average increase in the price of wheat or millet directly killed a proportion of the French population equal to nearly twice the percentage of Americans who died in the Civil War.
Why did you guys come over here to America in the first place? Because you guys were sick and poor. That's why. You couldn't even handle your own country. You guys had to come to America, wipe out the Indians. Make sure to get genocide.
But since both causes of death, disease, and famine were so common throughout Europe, many surviving records did not bother or were unable to make distinctions between them. Consequently, even today, historians find it difficult or impossible to distinguish between those of the citizenry who died of disease and those who merely starved to death. Roadside ditches, filled with stagnant water, served as public latrines in the cities of the 15th century, and they would continue to do so for centuries to follow. So too would other noxious habits and public health hazards of the time persist on into the future. From the practice of leaving the decomposing offal of butchered animals to fester in the streets, to London's special problem, as historian Lawrence Stone puts it, of poor's holes. These were large, deep open pits in which were laid the bodies of the poor, side by side, row upon row. Only when the pit was filled with bodies was it finally covered over with earth. As one contemporary, quoted by Stone, delicately observed, "How noisome is the stench that arises from these holes so stowed with dead bodies, especially in sultry seasons and after rain." Along with the stench and repulsive appearance of the openly displayed dead, human and animal alike, a modern visitor to a European city in this era would be repelled by the appearance and the vile aromas given off by the living as well. Most people never bathed, not once in an entire lifetime. Almost everyone had his or her brush with smallpox and other deforming diseases that left survivors partially blinded, pockmarked, or crippled, while it was the norm for men and women to have bad breath from the rotting teeth and constant stomach disorders which can be documented from many sources, while suppurating ulcers, eczema, scabs, running sores, and other nauseating skin diseases were extremely common and often lasted for years.
Why did you guys come over here to America in the first place? Because you guys were sick and poor. That's why. You couldn't even handle your own country. You guys had to come to America, wipe out the Indians. Make sure to get genocide.
Street crime in most cities lurked around every corner. One especially popular technique for robbing someone was to drop a heavy rock or chunk of masonry on his head from an upper-story window and then to rifle the body for jewelry and money. This was a time, observes Norbert Elias, when it was one of the festive pleasures of Midsummer Day to burn alive 1 or 2 dozen cats, and when, as Johann Huizinga once put it, the continuous disruption of town and country by every kind of dangerous rabble and the permanent threat of harsh and unreliable law enforcement nourished a feeling of universal uncertainty. With neither culturally developed systems of social obligation and restraint in place, nor effective police forces in their stead, the cities of Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries were little more than chaotic population agglomerates with entire sections serving as the residential turf of thieves and brigands, and where the wealthy were forced to hire torch-bearing bodyguards to accompany them out at night.
Why did you guys come over here to America in the first place? Because you guys were sick and poor. That's why. You couldn't even handle your own country. You guys had to come to America, wipe out the Indians. Make sure to get genocide.
Indeed, as in England, there were towns on the continent where as many as a third of the population were accused of witchcraft, and where 10 out of every 100 people were executed for it in a single year. In one small remote locale within reputedly peaceful Switzerland, more than 3,300 people were killed in the late 16th and 17th century for allegedly satanic activities. The tiny village of Wiesensteig saw 63 women burned to death in 1 year alone, while in Obermarchtel, 54 people, out of a total population of barely 700, died at the stake during a 3-year period. Thus, while it is true that the Europeans of those days possessed the same range of emotions that we do, as Stone puts it, it is noticeable that hate seems to have been more prominent an emotion than love.
Anti-whites don't know or care about truth and facts. All they want is to steal what Europeans built. They're petty tyrants who want what they could not build themselves, and they use Marxist lies to try and guilt white people into giving away their stuff.
Excuseer, dames en heren. Dus, je probeert dan terug je toekomst.
Ik begrijp echt niet wat er hier aan het gebeuren is.
We're not apologizing for being better at exploration and conquest. We're not apologizing for our ancestors who were stronger and smarter. We're not giving away our countries because your feelings are hurt. The only reason why so many non-whites are able to immigrate to this country and any white country today is through the generosity of Europeans.
Ja, ik vind dus dat dit echt niet kan hoor. Ik bedoel, meneer, maar moeten we nu nog antwoorden of niet? Want
Why did you guys come over here to America in the first place? Because you guys were sick and poor. That's why. You couldn't even handle your own country. You guys had to come to America, wipe out the Indians.
Make sure to get
Genocide.
Throughout Europe, about half the children being born during this time died before reaching the age of 10. Among the poorer classes, and in Spain particularly, which had an infant mortality rate almost 40% higher even than England's, things were much worse. In addition to exposure, disease, and malnutrition, one of the causes for such a high infant mortality rate, close to 3 out of 10 babies in Spain did not live to see their first birthdays, was abandonment. Thousands upon thousands of children who could not be cared for were simply left to die on dung heaps or in roadside ditches. Others were sold into slavery. East European children, particularly Romanians, seem to have been favorites of the 14th and 15th century slave trade, although many thousands of adults were enslaved as well. Child slaves, however, were as expensive as adults, for reasons best left to the imagination, as indicated by a 14th century letter from a man involved in the business. We are informed about the little slave girl you say you personally need, he wrote to his prospective client, and about her features and age, and for what you want her. Whenever ships come from Romania, they should carry some slave girls. But keep in mind that little slave girls are as expensive as the grown ones, and there will be none that does not cost 50 to 60 florins if we want one of any value. Those purchasing female slaves of childbearing age sometimes were particularly lucky and received a free bonus of a baby on the way. As historian John Boswell has reported, 10 to 20% of female slaves sold in Seville in the 15th century were pregnant or breastfeeding, and their infants were usually included with them at no extra cost.
All of America is everybody's land. Zero tolerance for criminal aliens. Zero.
Personally, I cringe every time I hear the word illegal.
I don't think that people realize that the first illegal immigrants were European settlers.
Hey, when was America actually great? What year are you talking about? 1776? That's when America was great?
That's probably a good number throughout there.
America was never great for everyone. Huh? It's never was great for everyone.
Then why wear that hat?
Huh?
Then why wear their hat?
We're trying to make it great. He's saying make it great 1776. It was never great for everyone, but we're working on it.
Right when you almost exterminated us, right? 1776? Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
It's so I don't know, like
you can't really change that.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't me. It wasn't my answer.
No, you can't change the genocide.
By making it great.
We can't change the genocide, but we can certainly change other things.
That's why I asked you. No, but that's why I asked you.
You're not responsible for that. No, of course not.
1776. I said never was great for everyone. That's the year I don't want to go to. I don't want to go back to the time where they were massacring indigenous people, where they had slaves. But that's what you're saying. America was great. It's horrible for you. We're working on it. No, I think it's horrible.
I wasn't alive.
I'm not a
then.
beneficiary. No, but you were saying that you want to go back to 1776.
You don't know why it was great? Because it built a name which created a country that we live in today. Not because of the Native American people who were killed, because it built what we have today.
Slavery, oppression, colonization, imposition of culture. Right? Which culture are we living in right now?
American culture.
Right. That came from where? I mean, because if you're talking about America, this continent, we had a culture here. You guys, your ancestors failed to assimilate. So now you, the invaders, the colonizers, are telling us to assimilate to your culture. No, well, I mean, that's, well, I said that your ancestors, I didn't say him. Right? But now you're the descendant. You're the descendant of those people, right? So now you guys are forcing us, or trying to force us, to assimilate to your culture, which is European based.
We're Colombian.
Yeah.
Has he forced you to assimilate to his culture?
Isn't that what Trump is doing?
It's America. We're free to do whatever we want. It's freedom, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Free to respect
So we're free.
So if America, if you're saying make America great again, so you're saying right now it's not great. What year?
We're not saying that.
It's not.
We're not saying it's not
This is
great.
just a
We never
catchy
said it wasn't
slogan.
great.
It was never great for everyone. It was never great for black people when they came over slaves. Is America great for you right now? Yeah, it's good for me. They're not going to say that again. It's just a slogan, bro. You don't need to take it literal. Okay, it's a slogan. Don't take it literal.
Oh, okay, so it's not literal. Okay.
Everything can be improved.
All right. No problem.
Cool. Thank you.
In precisely those years when Columbus was trekking around Europe in search of support for his maritime adventures, the Inquisition was raging in Spain. Here and elsewhere in Europe, those out of favor with the powerful, particularly those who were believed to be unchristian, were tortured and killed in one of the most ingenious of fashions, on the gallows, at the stake, on the rack, while others were crushed, beheaded, flayed alive, or drawn and quartered. On the very day that Columbus finally set forth on his journey that would shake the world, the port of the city he sailed from was filled with ships that were deporting Jews from Spain. By the time the expulsion was complete, between 120,000 and 150,000 Jews had been driven from their homes, their valuables, often meager, having first been confiscated.
We don't exploit other groups. We don't gain anything from their presence. They need us and not the other way around.
Ja, ik vind dus dat hij het echt niet kan hoor, ik bedoel, maar nee, maar moeten we nu nog antwoorden of niet, want
And so it went, from island to island, small and large, throughout the Caribbean. Wherever he went, Columbus planted a cross, making, as he said, the declarations that are required, and claiming ownership of the land for his royal patrons back in Spain. Despite the fact that Columbus noted in his own journal that the people of these lands do not understand me nor I them, it seems to have been a particular satisfaction to him that never once did any of the onlooking Arawak-speaking islanders object to his repeated proclamations in Spanish that he was taking control of their lands away from them. Ludicrous though this scene may appear to us in retrospect, at the time it was a deadly serious ritual, similar in ways equally ludicrous and deadly to the other famous ritual of the Spanish bestowed upon the non-Spanish-speaking people of the Americas, the recuerimiento. Following Columbus, each time the Spanish encountered a native individual or group in the course of their travels, they were ordered to read to the Indians a statement informing them of the truth of Christianity and the necessity to swear immediate allegiance to the Pope and to the Spanish crown. After this, if the Indians refused or even delayed in their acceptance, or more likely their understanding, of the recuerimiento, the statement continued. I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and matters that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. and we shall take your goods, and shall you do all the mischief and damage that we can. As to vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their lord and resist and contradict him. In practice, the Spaniards usually did not wait for the Indians to reply to their demands. First, the Indians were manacled. Then, as it were, they were read their rights. As one Spanish conquistador and historian described the routine, after they had been put in chains, someone read the requerimiento without knowing their language and without any interpreters. And without either the reader or the Indians understanding the language, they had no opportunity to reply. Being immediately carried away by prisoners, the Spanish not failing to use the stick on those who did not go fast enough.
We're not apologizing for being better at exploration and conquest. We're not apologizing for our ancestors who were stronger and smarter.
Ja, ik vind dus dat dit echt niet kan, hoor. Ik bedoel, maar nee, maar moeten we nu nog antwoorden of niet? Want
Well, if white Americans ever chose to go back to Europe, then they should take everything they built with them, or burn it all down to the ground and destroy it completely before leaving, and then take payment for what's left over.
The European intent was to kill 100% of our people so that they could have free land and free wealth throughout our continent. They failed at that. They missed killing that 5% of us that survived 500 years of Holocaust and genocide. The whole world knows about the Jewish Holocaust of 6 million killed by the Nazis. But we here on this continent know nothing of the Holocaust that killed 100 million of our people. Teaching truth in the face of lies and hidden histories of the last 500 years is difficult and may even seem impossible, but the truth can be told. But first we need to learn how we have been lied to. We are told that this continent was mostly empty, that we didn't believe in owning land, that we were total savages, living in the Stone Age and without any significant accomplishments. The truth is different from these lies of small wandering tribes and empty lands. The Spanish who invaded Mexico write of how they traveled from the coast in what is now called Veracruz up into the central part of Mexico and saw all of the land was being used for different types of agriculture. They saw 5 major city-states that were larger than any city in Europe. They marveled at the beauty and cleanliness of these cities and of the thousands of large and small towns they passed through. Europeans wrote of their amazement upon entering Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any city in Europe. It was the city of the Mexica, the city of the people falsely called Aztecs. In Tenochtitlan, they wrote of seeing restaurants, mandatory education for males and females, free hospitals, skilled doctors more advanced than any in Europe, and even public toilets, none of which existed in Europe at the time. They were especially awed by Mexica doctors and hospitals that were better than those in Europe. They wrote about the better quality of the Mexica world of medicine with pharmacies, with dentists, psychologists, and other medical specialties. They spoke of the marketplace of Tenochtitlan, which was larger than any of those of Europe. They were fascinated with a justice system that had none of the corruptions or injustices of the European legal systems. They spoke of the Mexica capital's beauty and asked themselves if they were not dreaming, because they could not have imagined that such a beautiful city was even possible. We know nothing of this today. The schools of today that support colonialism and media that promotes continued colonialism don't tell us that there were 7 cities larger than any of the cities of Europe in 1492. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, Huachinango, Cholula, and Tlaxcala all in what is now called Mexico, and Cusco and Cajamarca in what is now called Peru. We as Nicanflaca, as indigenous people of this continent, know nothing of this, and neither do the Europeans and the settled nations all across our continent. We are a people of ancient civilizations. Our civilizations began with the Caral area of Peru and in the El Porvenir area around 4700 BC. That is about 7,000 years ago. The oldest civilization in Europe that Europe claims is Mycenaean civilization of 2700 BC. But that civilization is more properly part of the civilizations of the Middle East and Egypt. All of this means that our civilizations are older than any of the civilizations of Europe. Europe itself did not invent the wheel, nor did it invent agriculture or any writing system, nor did they invent any civilization. The things that we think today of as European, like the Latin writing system and accomplishments in the early sciences, are all from the Middle East. Greek and Roman civilizations are direct offshoots of the Middle East. The Europeans are not truthful, even about their own history. How can we expect them to be truthful about the history of their actions on this continent? We have been told that history is told by the victors. Official European history is told to protect the guilty and to preserve the profits from the crimes of colonialism. But there are many hidden sources for true history. Europeans themselves wrote of their crimes on this continent. You have Columbus himself writing about all of his crimes against our people in the Caribbean in his journal. Things like, they were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They would make fine servants with 50 men who could enslave them all and make them do whatever they want. You have Bartolomé de las Casas, a Catholic priest, who wrote of all of the monstrous crimes of the Europeans in his book, The Devastation of the Indies. He writes, endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives, but our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The Admiral Columbus, it is true, was as blind as those who came after him, and he was anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. But even the official conquerors, the pirates, thieves, savages, who came after Columbus, wrote of their crimes in their journals and letters without even blushing at the massacres, deceit, theft, rapes, mutilation, kidnappings, extortions, and enslavement that they did on this continent. There is no scarcity of documentation of the evil that Europeans have done against our people. But there is a continued profit that has European settlers on this continent sitting in power, sitting silent on injustice, sitting silent on the ongoing genocide of our people.
We Europeans built big ships, traveled across the ocean using the stars to guide us, and we came, we saw, we claimed it, and we built it from nothing. There was no infrastructure to steal. Europeans created a nation others wish their people could have made.
Ja, ik vind dus dat dit echt niet kan hoor, ik bedoel, maar nee, maar moeten we nu nog antwoorden of niet, want
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
Nowhere around the world are there border walls to keep white people restricted. And yet it is the white people, the European descent people, who are the biggest supporters of border walls. That's because border walls are meant to keep the non-white races under the control of the white race, so that the white European descent people can enjoy the lands they have stolen after they left Europe. In other words, border walls as they exist today exist primarily to serve white people, the European colonists around the world. European descent borders and border walls preserve white privileges over the non-white populations of the world. That's why European descent people have been so eager to enforce their borders and border walls in the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa and along the US-Mexico border. White people, the European descent people, behave as if they have every right to trespass anyone's lands, regardless of their borders and border walls before white people were there. White people, they can just invade Iraq's borders and sovereignty. White people can invade and violate Iraq's borders and sovereignty, but then turn around and demand that their own white borders must be respected. White people take it for granted that they can move back and forth across the Mexican border to shop, to drink, and to piss on the sidewalk during spring break. But Mexicans must fill out lengthy paperwork, pay expensive fees, and ask for white permission to be allowed to cross the same Mexican border. Same border, different rules for different races. The rules have been drawn by European descent people to allow European colonist descendants to move freely on other people's lands, but the indigenous residents of those lands cannot move freely without white permission. Notice how European descent people never argue that they have no rights to violate the sacred borders of another nation, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. They just assume that they can give themselves the right to violently break into anyone's lands anytime they want to. And speaking of borders, isn't it interesting that white people don't put themselves on reservations? After all, they are the ones who have promoted reservations as being such a great idea. Europeans have forced non-whites onto reservations, reserves, and Bantustans around the world, from the Indian reservations to apartheid South Africa Bantustans to Australian Aborigine reserves. But they don't force white people onto reservations and Bantustans. Why is that? And isn't it interesting that white people, European descent people, don't put up border walls between their own families, even though they are perfectly eager to do this to other non-white peoples? So you see, border walls exist for the benefit of the white race. They may not think of it that way, but look at these border walls. They don't slow white people down one bit. Whites are free to cross these border walls at will, as shown along the US-Mexico border. European descent people are even constructing new borders today within Iraq, partitioning off entire neighborhoods and families. Who gave them permission to do this? The same thing is being done in Israel, where a European-born Russian can move to Israel and demand to segregate the Arabs with border walls, with complete impunity. For the last 500 years, European descent people have criminally operated on one white supremacist notion: that they alone can invade and steal non-European lands, that they alone, as a white race, should decide how those lands and peoples of the earth are partitioned with European borders and border walls. They alone, as the white race of Europe, are supposed to divide the world's non-European lands and races to their own European likings. And this right is based upon what authority? Simply because Europeans say so. To do this, European descent people have granted themselves permission to invade non-European lands with extreme violence, to commit genocide against non-European people, to steal land, resources, and freedom. And then, after they have stolen, raped, and enslaved, the European descent people have the monstrous gall to declare themselves to be honorable people, with all the rights to the lands and slaves they have stolen. And they declare that the people they have robbed have no rights to their lands whatsoever. What monsters! Europeans think they can just rob people of their birthrights to land, liberty, and human dignity, and they feel no shame whatsoever for the evils that they commit. No shame for the evils that they have profited from. In fact, get this, they celebrate these evil crimes and declare themselves to be honorable people, freedom-loving people. Whites, Europeans, have decided in criminal fashion that they are not responsible for their crimes of trespassing and land theft simply because it's in the past. But it's interesting to note that they want to keep all the profits from the past. It's interesting that the Europeans want to keep all the lands from the past and the resources from the past. All the crimes of the past are no problem to them as long as they get to profit from the past. Why don't European descent people ever say that they will give up their stolen lands and stolen wealth because, after all, it's in the past and has no relevance to today? Basically, European descent people want the infallible right to steal our lands and then demand that we respect their crimes with borders. Is this what honorable people do? It's evil. It's criminal. It's what monsters would do. And now we come back to the main point, that there are no border walls against white people, against Europeans and their European colonists leeching off stolen lands around the world. If the white race from Europe thinks borders are so sacred, then why didn't they respect the sovereignty and territorial rights of our indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere? White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. If European colonist descendants want to build border walls, they're more than welcome to do so. 1, by moving back to Europe, and 2, by sealing Europe's borders away from the rest of the non-white world. Now that would be a border wall that much of humanity would support. Until then, fuck European borders outside of Europe. This is our continent, and we have the right to be everywhere on our continent. Europeans have the right to be in Europe, and they can have as many border walls as they want there.
Label me supremacist, radical with intention to reconquist the ignorant, yelling out indigenous. I'll never let the school system ban the studies of my heritage.